the best!
Hey grade 7s, today we're going to talk about percentages and how we can use mental math to make certain calculations. So, if we had a number like 50 and we wanted to find out 10% of that number, we would go through, we'd go 10% is the same as 1/10. We'd take 1/10 and we would multiply it by 50, and that would give us 5. Remember that when we have 0.1, essentially what we're doing is we are multiplying by 1/10, which is the same as dividing by 10. And when we divide by 10, we move the decimal one place value over to the left. That means if we want to find 10% of any number, all we need to do is move the place value 1 to the left. So if we want to find out 10% of 50, all we need to do is take the decimal and move it over one place value to the left, or divide by 10, and we get 5. So just a couple quick examples. If I want to find 10% of 35, all I'm going to do is move the decimal over one place value and I get 3.5. Or if I want 10% of 4 2/10, all I'm going to do, same thing, move my decimal over one place value and I get 42 hundredths. Now, if I wanted to know 50% of a number, it's a little bit different. So if I wanted 50% of 50, all I would do is, I remember that 50% is the same as 1/2, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 1/2, multiply it by 50, and that's going to end up giving me 25. So what that means is, for 50%, what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide that number in half. So once again, just a couple quick examples. If I wanted to find 50% of 80, all I would do is take 80 and divide it by 2, which would end up giving me 40. And same thing, if I ended up taking 50% of 32, I would just take 32, divide it in half, and that would give me 16. Now, if I wanted to find 20% of a number, all I would need to know is that 20% is double of 10%. So, as long as I can find 10% of a number, I just double it and that would give me 20%. So if I wanted 20% of 50, 10% of 50 would move the decimal over one place, which gives us 5. Double that, 20% would be 10. If I wanted 20% of 35, I would find 10%. So I move the decimal over one place value, gives me 3.5. And then I would end up doubling that, which would end up giving me 7. For a lot of these, you just combine the numbers. So if I want 60%, we know that 60% comes from 50%, which we can find, and 10%, which we can find. So if I wanted to find 60% of 50, what I would end up doing is I would find 50%, which we divide it by 2, gives us 25. 10%, I move the decimal over once, which gives me 5. Then I put them together, so 60% would end up giving me 30. Same thing, if I wanted to find 40% of a number, there's a couple ways to do it. First one, I know that 40% is 10% less than 50%. So if I wanted 40% of 90, I could find 50%, divide it by 2, so which would give me 45. 10%, which would end up giving me 9, and then I would end up subtracting, which gives me 36. The other way would be is if I took 10% of 90 and multiplied it by 4. So I end up taking 10% and move the decimal over once, which gives me 9. I multiply it by 4 to get 40%, which ends up giving me the same answer of 36. So if we want to find 5%, very similar, we end up going with half of 10%. So what we're going to end up doing is if we want to find 5% of 50, what we're going to end up doing is finding 10%, so move the decimal over one place, and then which gives us 5, and then we're going to divide that by 2, which ends up giving us 2.5. Another quick example is if we want to find 5% of 90, all we would do is we'd find 10%, so we move the decimal place over by 1, we get 9, then we take half of that, and we end up getting 4.5. Now we can actually use all of this information to combine any of these numbers. So 65% of a number, what we would end up doing is we would find 50%, so we divide it by 2, which gives us 25. 10%, which we'd move our decimal place 1 over, which would give us 5. And then 5%, which is half of that, gives us 2.5. Add them all up, and 25 plus 5 is 30, plus 2.5 gives us 32.5. So, same thing, if we wanted to find 35% of a number, 35% of 80, we'd end up finding 10% first and multiplying it by 3. So 10% of 80, move the decimal place value over 1, ends up giving us 8. Multiply that by 3, ends up giving us 24. And then 5% is half of 10%, so we get 4. And we end up adding those together, and we end up with 28. All right, if you have any questions, feel free to message me anytime. Just remember, don't be mean, be an outlier.